I went from 1400 to 2100 in just 2 months, and I'm gonna tell you how I did it, so you can do the same thing. The only thing I cared about during these games was not a fluffy pawn or this one, it was the weaknesses. A weakness is a square that is attacked more times than it is defended.
Look at this dude.
And with that in mind, let's jump into the first game. Alright, so for the first game we have, of course, a Sicilian, and we have a Smith-Morra gambit. Of course, they take the pawn, they go c3, and I go pawn to d3, so they have to take with the bishop. Now we develop everything all very nicely, and he goes pawn to e5, attacking the knight on f6. Of course, I take the pawn, he takes back with the knight, and I go queen to b6. This is not the main line, but I want to be very aggressive, so I confuse my opponent a little. He goes bishop to c4, moving the bishop for the second time. Of course, this rings bells because it is not natural to move the bishop twice, and he's attacking the weakness on f7 with the bishop and with the knight. It is only defended with the king. And not only is a weakness if he takes with the bishop, that would also be checkmate because I cannot go to d8 because of the queen. So let's not fall for that and just go pawn to e6. And now he goes knight to a3, and of course I take that with the bishop, creating a lot more weaknesses in his position. And now I go queen to c5, attacking the knight on e5 twice, with the knight and with the queen at the same time. He goes rook to b1, not realizing that I was attacking the knight twice. So of course I take it with the knight. He does not take back, but he attacks my queen first. The problem is, that bishop was defended by the knight on e5. But the knight is gone, so I just take the bishop, and my opponent resigns. That's it! I beat a 1600 in just 13 moves. If you take the knight with the rook, then the bishop would fall. And if you take it with the bishop, then the rook falls. So there's just nothing to do here. So that was a quick win. And let's jump into the second game. Alright, so in this game, we are the one facing the queen's gambit, but of course I decline it by going pawn to e6, and we go over the opening quite quickly because this is all just basic theory. He goes rook to c1, putting a little bit of pressure on the pawn on c7. Of course, I just attack the bishop first, asking him if he wants to take, if he wants to go back. He goes back, so I go pawn to b6 to develop the bishop via b7. But as soon as he moves the bishop, now we take the pawn on c4, so the bishop has to move again. Now, of course, I develop my bishop, he castles, and I go rook to c8, preparing a pawn push on c5. Now he goes rook to e1, of course I push the pawn on c5, I was preparing that the whole time, and he goes back with the bishop. Now I go knight to d5, asking for some more exchanges. He still does not want to exchange anything, so I just put my knights on better squares. Now he goes pawn to e4, attacking my knight on d5. Of course, now I take on c3, he takes back, and I go pawn to c4. That is not the best move, removing the tension in the center, but it's not bad either. The bishop has to go back, and now we connect the rooks by going queen to d7. Now my opponent goes pawn to e5, of course attacking the knight, we just go knight to d5, and now my opponent goes queen to c2, threatening checkmate on h7. Of course, we're not gonna let that happen, and we go pawn to g6. Now he goes pawn to h4, very aggressive opponent. He wants to go h5 and just destroy my kingside. So I just go bishop to c6, and as soon as he goes h5, I go bishop to a4, attacking the queen, trying to get the queen out of this diagonal. But the problem is, the queen can still go to e4, and I would be in a little bit of danger. Thankfully, my opponent did not see that, and he went queen to d2. Now, this pawn is attacked 2 times by the pawn and by the bishop on b1, so I go king to h7. Not the best move either, because I'm walking straight into a pin from the bishop on b1, but I want to keep the g-file open for my rook. Thankfully, he takes on g6, just removing the tension, so I don't have to worry about this pin anymore, at least not that much. Now he goes rook to e4, and I go bishop to a3, attacking the rook on c1, but he does not care about this rook because he goes rook to h4, attacking the weakness on h6, which is attacked by the queen and by the rook at the same time, and it is only defended by my king. So I go queen to g7 first, defending this pawn, and now he has a beautiful tactic, but he didn't see it, so that's good. He could go knight to g5 check. Of course I cannot take that because the pawn is pinned, and as soon as I move my king back, he could take the pawn on e6 with a fork. Instead, my opponent went rook to e1, getting the rook out of danger. And now I go bishop to e7, attacking the rook and preventing knight to g5. He goes back with the rook, and at this point I think I'm a little bit too passive, so I start pushing the pawns on the queen side. And just now he goes knight to g5 check, but I can just take that with the bishop, of course. He takes back with the queen, and I go bishop d7. Now he brings the other rook into the attack as well, and now the rook is blocking the way of the bishop, so I can go rook to f5, attacking the queen. They go back, and now I go pawn to g5. So the pawn on h6 can breathe a little bit. But of course he goes rook to g4, and now this rook is pinned. I bring my other rook to the f-file, and he goes bishop to h4. Of course, if I take the bishop, he would take my queen. So instead I go king to g8, walking out of the pin from the bishop. He takes the rook, I take back, and he takes the pawn on g5 with the bishop. Now if I take the bishop, he could take back with the rook, and now my queen is pinned. So instead, of course, I take the rook on g4 first, and he takes the pawn on h6. I simply go queen to g6, and if you take the rook on f8 now, I will take your rook and threatening checkmate at the same time. So he moves his rook out of danger, I move my my rook out of danger, and he goes bishop to g5. Now I give a little check on b1 first. He goes king to h2. I give another check with the rook. He has to block with the bishop, and then I go queen to g6, attacking the bishop twice, and it is only defended by the queen on d2. So of course he goes king to g1, defending the bishop with the rook as well. Then I repeat moves just one more time, and then I go knight to e7 followed by knight to f5, attacking the bishop 3 different times. And it is only defended twice, so they have to move bishop g5. But instead my opponent went pawn to d5. So of course I take it, he takes back, and now I'm up 2 minor pieces. But he has these 2 passed pawns, so I have to be really careful. He goes pawn to e6, attacking the bishop. I have to bring my bishop back. Then he takes the pawn on c4, I give a check, and then I go queen to e1, attacking some things. He gets a little bit too excited and goes pawn to d6, but the problem is that now I have queen to e5, check, and winning the pawn on d6 on the next move. And at this point my opponent resigned. And now we move on to the third game of the video, and we have of course a queen's gambit, but this time they accepted finally. Now we go knight to c3. They want to defend the pawn on c4, so I don't take it very easily, and I go pawn to a4, attacking the defender on b5. Now he goes bishop d7. I want to destroy the pawn structure, so I go d5, and he goes pawn to e6, not making things very easy for me. I develop my bishop, and he goes pawn to a6, and now I see the opportunity to give him a total nightmare. So first I take on b5, and then we take the pawn on e6. If you take with the bishop, then I can take your queen and you can't castle anymore, and then I can take the pawn on b5, which you cannot take back because the rook would fall. And if you take with the pawn, which is what my opponent did, now I have queen to h5 check, making you go g6, a very ugly move. Notice that the king is very weak now. So I go queen to e5, attacking the rook on h8. He goes queen to f6, defending that, and then I go queen to c7 because I want to put my bishop on e5. He gets a little bit scared about this idea, so he goes back with the queen to d8. But the problem is, I can take the queen now, and you can't castle anymore. And then I go bishop to e5. And there's no way in hell to defend the rook on h8. He goes pawn to b4, trying to create some counter attack. I go knight to a4, bishop b5, and I go knight b6, attacking the rook on a8. Now both rooks are under attack. He goes rook a7, and now the rook is not defending the knight anymore. So I take the knight first, then he attacks both my pieces, but I just bring the bishop back. And if you take my knight, which is what my opponent did, I will just take the rook on h8. But he wants to keep playing. He's pushing the pawns, trying to create some threats. I go knight to e5, he attacks my knight, and now I have a fork this way, but instead I fork this other way, winning a pawn in the process. He keeps trying to create a passed pawn, but of course that's just not gonna happen. I pin the bishop, he walks out of the pin, finally castle. We have knight f6, I take that, I'm threatening now pawn to e5 with a fork. He runs with the king, I go e5 anyway. He gives me a check, I move out, he goes bishop e3, attacking the pawn, I go g3 just to never worry about that pawn anymore. And then I just very slowly force the exchange of the rooks, and my opponent resigns. And now I'm 1754, but that was just like for 2 days. Then I hit 1800, 1950. It was all extremely easy with the very simple concept of the weaknesses. So don't forget to look for weaknesses and torture your opponent when you find them. You don't want to miss the next video for anything in the world. So subscribe and turn on the notifications, and I will see you in the next game.